Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. Registration for the Numinous School opens on June 1st. If you would like to secure one of the limited spots in this annual program, just go to my website, carmenspaniola.com, and sign up for the waitlist. On today's show, I'm speaking with Layla Kristy Feghali of River Rose Apothecary. Layla literally partners with plant allies and ancestors to do their work, and believes that in the same way that human bodies can carry trauma, so can plant bodies, and also in the same way that human bodies and plant bodies can carry that trauma, they can also carry medicine, resilience, and ancient wisdom. I connected with Layla online. They were at home in LA. So Layla, what identities do you lead with?
That's a good question. Interesting question. There's a lot of different ways to talk about identities on the kind of socio-political world that we live in. I identify as Swana, which stands for Southwest Asian and North Africa, otherwise known as the Middle East, sometimes as Arab, which I will spare the complexities of that identity right now, but for geopolitical purposes, definitely as Arab, as queer, as woman, as femme of center. I think that in so many ways, like I identify kind of as a person between worlds, in the sense that I am a child of diaspora. I'm a child of immigrants. I'm, a person who really straddles, realities between worlds in so many ways, including in, my own practice of just how I live life. And so there's a lot of just in-betweenness even with my queerness, and just with all my different identities. And I think that increasingly as I, kind of grow into myself and just outside of the context, and also very much within the context of this social world we live in, it feels more important to me to identify with my purpose, with my purpose in the world. And I think that's something I've really learned and taken from, every Indigenous teacher, elder, mentor, and tradition I've ever had the honor of learning from, is just identifying with the place that I'm from, with the place that I live, and very much with the purpose that I carry, the spiritual purpose that I carry. And I think that's still unfolding, but in a lot of ways it's also very between the worlds, because my purpose feels very much about kind of remembering my ancestors and being kind of a collector, regathering their stories and sort of sharing the stories in my own heart.
Can you locate us geographically then? When you say you identify as Swana, can you take us even a little, like locate us in exactly what that land is that you belong to, and your relationship to it? Because you also live in LA and grew up in LA. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yes, thank you for asking that. So both my parents are from Lebanon, which is, for people who aren't familiar, in between Syria and Palestine. So it's on the Eastern Mediterranean coast, otherwise known, often referred to as the Arab world. And I'm careful using that phrase because it's a very ethnically diverse region. And so, geopolitically, I think it's kind of taboo to be Arab. So it's a reclaiming to claim that. But internally, it's also, important for me to just acknowledge the incredible ethnic diversity of that region, and not erase that, nor my own ethnically diverse ancestors within that region through seeing that.
Mhm.
So I've come to prefer the term Swana. It's a less Eurocentric term than the Middle East, and it's a more inclusive and geographical description of a region that is than Arab, the Arab world
Mhm.
per se. Um, so my parents are both from Lebanon. My mother is from a village in the south of Lebanon, and my father's from a village in the north of Lebanon. And um, there was a civil war going on in Lebanon for most of my childhood, from about 75 to 93. And it's kind of always still under the surface of things, unfortunately, and erupts from time to time. So my parents both independently left under different circumstances for different reasons through the war, and ended up meeting here in the United States, indigenously referred to by some tribes as Turtle Island. Um, and then they met each other and moved to the LA area, indigenously referred to as mostly Tongva territories that I live in and have grown up in. So my relationship for a lot of my early life, we didn't really spend too much time there because of the war. But I grew up in a very uh, culturally traditional family around a lot of Lebanese and other Arab communities and families. So I sort of had a private life that was very much Lebanese, and a public life that was a little bit more American.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. So after the war settled down, I did start visiting Lebanon somewhat regularly with my parents, because my father's whole family still lived there, including my grandmother and all my aunties and uncles and cousins, and parts of my mother's family still lived there. So, um, yeah, I remember right when the airport opened again after the war, I remember taking a solo trip with my father.
Oh.
It was a very interesting experience as a 9 or 10-year-old, in a very, yeah, freshly post-war um, environment, and I have a lot of memories from that trip.
Was it kind of scary?
No, actually, it was beautiful and magical, and really a nice immersion. And the as a kid, it's like the kinds of luxuries you are used to in the first world are not necessarily as important to you. But it was a really good immersion for me, and sort of, just not having certain luxuries like a lot of people around the world do, like, hours of no electricity, and like hanging out in candlelight with my cousins and aunties, and taking showers in like lukewarm trickles of water that, in the middle of winter. And, the airport was chaotic with people smoking, and, military people all around, and guns and cigarettes, but lots of love and hugs, and like, all kinds of chaos. And and Lebanon is a very my father is a really special person to me, and he really always, there's something very indigenous about him in his essence, and that he's very connected to the place that he is
Mm.
from, and very of the land kind of feeling. So I had a very like romantic sort of, father-daughter thing with my dad as a little girl. So in some ways, Lebanon was very familiar to me because it was so much the essence of my dad. So being in the mountains and, experiencing the land, actually, even from that young age, was really familiar and really magical to me.
Mm. Is that how your relationship with plants became developed?
Maybe indirectly, without my consciousness and not my conscious knowledge. But I kind of was always a kid who, I think that when you grow up in diaspora and to immigrant parents and sort of between the worlds in that way, at least for me, there was always this kind of like tugging to understand where I belonged, and to just understand the fullness of the picture that I was from, like try to make sense of myself.
Mm.
Because I felt very in between places, um, and the tensions and just the complexity of that was always tugging at me. So I was always the kid who was asking my parents for stories about Lebanon and stories about my ancestors and stories about this and stories about that. In fact, on that trip, my dad, he always tells me, he's like, you completely embarrassed me because, I hadn't been to Lebanon in like, 8 years. And you, as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old girl, the first thing you said when we got to my village was, when are we going to visit the grave of my grandfather, who I had never met? And he was like, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? And my, 9-year-old daughter is so, and so part of the stories that I was told was about my grandfather, who died before my parents were married, and who was a poet who used to write poetry about tending his fig trees and his olive groves, and had like a very a strong love of plants, and was a plant tender. And so, and my mother's side of the family, my maternal grandmother, who lives in the diaspora too, actually, she's also very much a plant tender. So in this indirect way, I think my father's sort of very, very soulful relationship with the land and the coast and the water and just the really very natural elements of where he was from did kind of translate into this sort of awareness and respect for the natural world and the plant realms. But I was raised by my parents very much, like, okay, you focus on school. We brought you guys here to do well. All those things that, of the earth that we know, we're not really going to emphasize teaching them to you, because, now we're on a professional route, we're like trying to make life happen in the diaspora, and all the ways that development and colonization and displacement and migration, and just like capitalism affect traditional peoples and cultures. And so in some ways it probably did influence me, but in a very subtle way. And so I basically, because I was always kind of tugging back for that understanding, as soon as I was old enough to start coming back on my own, I like in university years, I would start coming and taking, my whole summer there and spending time in the village with my grandmother and trying to collect stories and just being there, and kind of moving back and forth, which is what you see now.
And so who first introduced you to the magical world of plants and their medicines, and how you could be in relationship with them and the land through them?
Yes, that's a great question. So I have that backdrop of just coming from traditional families of plant people, including, very embarrassing memories as little kids, like being at like going to a birthday party at the park, and my grandma or aunt or my mom seeing, or one of the Lebanese grandmas or aunties we were with being like, how is that fruit tree full of fruits and those people are just letting it fall on the floor? We need to go harvest them. So there was that. And I have to acknowledge and credit that, for the place that it has in my awareness of the plants. And then, when I was in my 20s, I'm so bad with years. I'm kind of bad with linear things in general. But at some point in my early adult years, I was kind of on like a deep personal healing journey around a lot of my own trauma and a lot of my ancestral trauma and a lot of different things that were coming up. And I was sort of just seeking in general a lot of, I was just seeking healing, really. And I think during that time, a lot of different pieces and ways of healing started coming into my life and introducing themselves. And One of them was a curandera, who's a Mexican traditional healer. Her name was Estela Roman, and she actually was introduced to me through by a friend of mine, Atava Garcia Swaiseki, who is the founder of a really lovely school for plant and indigenous and folk and ancestral knowledge in Oakland called Ancestral Apothecary. And I kind of was starting to be a little interested in exploring plants at that time with Atava, but I ended up actually taking one of her dream circles. I was part of a dream circle that she was hosting, and she would incorporate plants in there. And sometimes I would help her medicine make and do stuff like that. So I was kind of starting to move into that at that time. And then I was working and studying a little bit with Estela, who continued to teach me a little bit about plants. Although it wasn't the focus of her practice, it was certainly an introduction. And both of them kind of gave me an introduction that was very much more about using plants in a ceremonial or a spiritual and energetic way to kind of support your emotional healing and your spiritual healing processes. And so at that time, that's what I needed. And that's really what I was drawn to. And my dreams started honestly introducing me to the plants and to their medicine and instructing me to take that journey a little bit deeper. So eventually I ended up going to school, getting formal education by Karen Sanders and Sarah Holmes up at a school in Northern California near Mount Shasta called the Blue Otter School for Herbal Medicine. And so they were my first formal teachers, and I've been very blessed to have other teachers since.
And so what would you say, if you could choose some highlights for listeners to kind of get into a connected state or receptive orientation towards the plant kingdoms, the plant realms, let's say, what would you say are the most important lessons that your teachers have taught you about how to be in right relationship with plants?
That's a really good question. I've been very fortunate because I think all of the teachers I've had are indigenous and or have an indigenous understanding or framework for approaching plants and the context of this land. And so, the protocols all include reciprocity and gestures of reciprocity and permission and responsibility in different ways. So I'm going to we could go into those deeper too if you would like to, but I think that underlying all of it, it's really just to be in relationship, like actually be in relationship, meaning that I think that, in the Western mind and way of thinking, sometimes like we still have a very clinical approach to plants where they're more like objects that we can use that have specific functions, and everything's really like this equals that and this equals that and this is what it's used for. And we don't really, sometimes people just actually don't know how to be in relationship at all, meaning being present and actually listening and actually opening yourself to experiencing with all your senses the being that you're interacting with and what it is you are feeling and learning through that relationship. And in some ways directly and in a lot of ways indirectly, I think the biggest teaching I've received is just is really just about that, is about being in relationship and just how diverse, our individual relationship with any individual plant is, like how non-mechanical it actually is.
Yeah, you had a beautiful post on Instagram. If people want to follow you, it's River Rose Apothecary, right?
Yes.
hmm You had a beautiful post about looking for a particular plant, and you were on a hike with friends or cousins and looking for this particular plant, and you called out to this plant. And I just thought, like out loud, because I've done that, in my mind. It's like, yeah, I'm going to commute like it's, telepathic. But I thought, sometimes I have a tree in my backyard. I call my ancestor tree. It's a big ash tree. And so I often greet it, or I sometimes, greet them with my ancestor's name, this particular ancestor that I work with. They're one and the same to me in many ways. And I always sort of thought, well, that's very private. I only like say it just to her. I couldn't imagine calling it out. And then I thought, wow, why not? It's so beautiful. So like when you're saying you're in a relationship, you really mean it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm like not kidding at all. In fact, I think I'm a little extra on that. I mean, anyone who knows me truly will just attest to the fact that I might be like the annoying auntie who like really, I hope not totally smothers, but just like has uncontainable love for my little niece or nephew or like my puppies, and like the plants really get a lot of that. So I have this like inner maybe like 5 or 7 year old girl that really gets to play when I'm hanging out with the plants and with the natural world in general. And so yeah, it's funny you mentioned that story because that specific plant is it was a rue plant. And it's funny because in that dream circle where I took with Atava in the very beginning of my, kind of like ushering in my more extensive relationship with plants. I was searching for teachers at that time, and um, because the dreams started to come to me at that time. And that was the specific plant that I remember from that class that she had brought in one day, just, probably was blooming in her garden, and she decided to bring it and she started talking to us about it. And I was so profoundly drawn to it and connected to it. And I would later find out that that plant, while used extensively in the, curanderismo traditions here and in a lot of indigenous diasporic traditions, from the West African diasporic traditions to, all across like Latin America and, yeah, all over the place, really, here and Brazil and Mexico and Maya land and everywhere. But that it actually is native to my region. And in fact, it was native to my village. And in fact, my cousins would tell me, because I started, later on, I was like, wow, like this plant is so special to me. And then I learned, that it was native to that area. And so on that walk, my cousins were telling me, oh yeah, we used to see that plant all the time. When we were growing up, we would come back smelling like it. And it has a very strong fragrance that some people greatly dislike and some people love. And so I was calling it out loud, and I do get teased. It is a little personal and intimate, and my cousins continue to tease me to this day. They're like, oh my God, the girl who talks to flowers, literally out loud. But I think they probably find it a little endearing too. So I was calling it because I knew that it was somewhere there, and and she responded. We got detoured at the end of our quote unquote at the end of our walk, and it was like in those few yards of a detour that she was smack in the middle of the path. And my cousin had been telling me from the very end of our trail when I started calling her, because I didn't find her and I was so sad. He had been like, yeah, could you stop? Like, we're not going to find her, like you're still bent on finding her. And when I, found her and I was like, come, look. And he was like, whoa, okay. Well,
So when you were calling, were you like, Rue, where are you? Or do you have like a particular song to try to sort of coax her and like flirt her out? Or, is it courtship, or is it just like, hey, I'm here? Like, is it like Marco Polo? How are you
I
doing?
think it's like different things. I was just following my own heart and just like saying it out loud. But I think on that particular walk, I was more like, Rue, where are you? Like a little bit more like that, or like, and probably a little bit of like, I love you. I want to see
Yeah.
you, like, I know you're
Oh.
here, So yeah,
Oh,
and
that's so
I
sweet.
think that's it's the it's the it's like a place where this is part of my love for plants. It's just that there's a lot of safety, I think, for me, and being able to express those kind of playful and also just very between the worlds and very magical parts of
Mhm.
myself, and for it to be so profoundly well received and
Mm.
responded to, and it's really magical. It's really and it's really intimate and healing, and in and of itself.
Yeah. So here's a question that I'm pretty sure is going to be really juicy and interesting. How is your foraging process different when you're in LA versus your ancestral homelands in Lebanon?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was kind of mentioning to you before, but so the term foraging does not resonate with me at all. In fact, I kind of cringe a little when I hear it. I know it's like a common term in the plant world, but I don't really identify as a forager. And I think part of that, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I think that I have a colonial association with that term. It feels like going in and just taking things. And it feels like the opposite of relationship to me. It feels like, you know, extracting. It feels so extractive. So so I guess I don't do much I'll say gathering in that way, because my practice is less traditional in its clinical expressions than I think a lot of um, other people who would call themselves herbalists. Um, and it's a lot more about that relationship and about kind of, it's almost like it's like building that relationship for the healing. Like for me, that is the medicine. It's almost like that's all it takes. Like that was my medicine. I didn't need to take Rue home with me. I didn't need to do that. I just needed to commune in that moment. So let's see. There's multiple pieces. My foraging process does not it doesn't really exist too much, but when I do need to gather plants, it actually doesn't look very different here or in Lebanon. And the reason why is that, and I guess I have to give a little background about this. So I was taught, and and the first person who taught me this was Karen Sanders, who was my teacher at Blue Water School. Um, and I've had many teachers who have, and just peers and just other plant lovers who have shared and spoken about this before. We live in very compromised ecosystems in a lot of ways. Capitalism and just colonialism and development really do a number on our natural environments, and especially on the native plants, which are already enduring quite a lot, just as native people have and are on these lands and in all the places where they have been exterminated, quite frankly, in order to create space um, for people that were, yeah, settlers, basically. And so I think and then we have climate change, and we have all these other ways that humans have contributed to compromising our natural world. And so our plants are so abundant and so generous for still being here, and they're also very much in a delicate space of being severely compromised. So on this land, I do consider, and Karen Sanders would teach us that, you have to be aware that when you're harvesting in this land and you're not from this land, you could be harvesting, first of all, from a patch of land that a local native family has been tending to in the wild and harvesting for years. You could be harvesting in an area that used to be 12 times more abundant and is not doing very well. You could be harvesting in a way that actually is jeopardizing the life of a certain animal or other non-human being that literally depends on it, and who we all need to keep the ecosystem alive and well. So there's all these other relationships that we have to consider, and I think in this kind of delicate time, it's really important. So I actually, here, I tend not to, I really tend to avoid wild crafting of all kinds. And what I was taught by Karen is that if you are going to wildcraft, you should be in relationship with the place you're going to wildcraft from for, I think she would say, 7 years. And you should know that place in every season. You should know because you should be tending it. You want to build that relationship, both as a form of reciprocity, but also as a form of consciousness of, like, you need to know, is this a healthy space? Are these plants endangered? It looks like there's a lot right now, but maybe it's actually not a lot because it used to be 6 times as much. And so being able, and you'll be able to see, is someone else harvesting from here? Is this somebody else's, plot of land? And just have a more responsible relationship to where you're gathering from. And I tend not to, I just tend to try to go to like organic sources or friends who grow, or to grow myself if I can. And if I'm really in a desperate situation, then I will just consider what I know, what I just shared, and go to places I know. And sometimes if I'm with an elder or a mentor, particularly if they're indigenous to this land and they invite me, or I'm on land that somebody I know is tending and they invite me to harvest or gather from their land, then I'll do that. And then in Lebanon, even though I am like allowed to be there in a different way, I guess, like I belong there, or like I'm not a settler there, even though I honestly haven't lived there for most of my life. I mean, and in a lot of ways, like, this land knows me more, in a certain sense. And the spirits of this land are the ones who have been kind of taking care of me every day and supporting me to live for most of my early years. But in Lebanon, we face the same problems with just like a really hugely rapid development, and the native plants are really being threatened. So my dream in Lebanon is really actually to have my ancestral home be kind of like a sanctuary for the native plants, and to start moving the native plants there so that I can both harvest them from my own land, but also tend to them to ensure that as things develop further, that there's at least one place where the ecosystem that is uplifted by those plants can be intact. So I have a teacher here, she's a Raramuri elder. Her name is Olivia Chumacero, and she has been really, really just a profound teacher in terms of teaching about restoring native plants. And, Karen used to talk about this a bit too, just like, you want to be good to the nature around you and to the wild around you and to the native communities and ecosystems that you're a part of. Like, yeah, be in reciprocity, go scatter seeds instead of going to harvest, go scatter seeds in the fall, go pull invasives, like remove invasive plants. Like, so there's a good wildcrafting process. Like you want to wildcraft the dandelions, you know what I mean? Wildcraft the non-native species of plants that also have so much medicine. And it'll be like a win-win-win situation.
Nice. I'm looking forward to doing some of that. This podcast is a complement to a year-long intuition development program I have called the Numinous School. And it's been running, it'll be 5 years this year. And when you've done it 1 year, you can just keep taking it like again and again. And so for those people who've been in it for a while, this fall in 2018, we'll embark on a practicum program. And we're going to meet on all the solstices and equinoxes, and some of them will have teachers. So it'll really be about gathering for ceremony. But one of the teachers that I just love has also been on the Numinous podcast is Tiffany Joseph, and she's from the Squamish and the Sartlip First Nations local. And I said, what should we do to get out on the land? And she'll come and do territorial acknowledgement. But I also said, I'd love to have the group come out. And she said, let's pull blackberries. And I was like, yes, let's all get together and work and do some pulling while you just tell us about the ecosystems. Because where her traditional territories are, but also her current home, was a cranberry bog. But now there will never be cranberries that could even be rehabilitated there because it was industrial farmland after that, you know. And so it's very heartbreaking that even if they had the means to try to restore that habitat, actually it'll be so many generations before those plants could live there anymore. That I'm really excited to do that kind of work with her. I'm curious, so you've talked about some of the reciprocity protocols, and I'm wondering, let's say there was a little, you know, plot of land or a little section of a trail or something like that you wanted to tend to. I'm thinking in particular of, I love the native roses from here, the Nootka rose, and they're so fragrant that I would love to be able to gather from some of them. But I'm thinking, okay, well, I would find a trail that has, you know, quite a lot of it, and then I would have to visit there again and again. So I'm curious if you have any spiritual protocols if you were going to be in relationship and be stewarding this land here on this land as a settler. What have you developed, or what do you do to make sure that spiritually you're on the land in a good way? And I'm thinking, well, you've sort of laid this beautiful banquet for us in terms of everything you've already said, but I'm curious kind of from a ritual perspective, if there's anything you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think some of the things that we've already talked about are actually like really what I do, which is just comes back to the relationship piece, which is like, it's funny because I think you asked the question about being in right relationship, and that is such indigenous languaging, right? I mean, at least in my knowledge of that term. And so I think it's like, what it like being in right relationship, meaning like being in relationship, you know, like that's really it. So I think that, you know, acknowledging and, you know, making an offering to the spirits of the place that I am in, no matter.
Do you give water? Do you give your hair? Do you give, like, do you have special things that you give?
So, I mean, you know, in this context, I was always taught to give tobacco, and I know that's more of a native tradition, North American native tradition, and probably not for every tribe either, but for the people who I have learned from. For me, you know, and so sometimes when I'm here, I feel called to do that, and I actually grow my own tobacco, and so I try to like give tobacco that I've grown. And so I sometimes when I'm here, I like to honor that specifically here. because I feel like it's an honor to it's honoring the spirits of this land, because that is the thing that honors the spirits of this land. Sometimes if I don't have it, I think it's like, and I've been taught too that I think it's less about what you offer sometimes too, and just more about offering. So sometimes I'll offer a song, or water, or just a prayer, or just, you know whatever it is. And then I do think sometimes about that, though, when I'm in other places, like, what honors the spirits of the place that I'm in. It's probably different in different places, even though tobacco still carries the energy, that it carries wherever it is. So I think, so offering something, and not just offering it, but speaking, introducing yourself, and um just speaking your intention, and just like, just acting right, like you would with a human, like, really, that's really what it is, right? If you go and you meet your partner's grandmother for the first time, like, how are you going to act with her? Are you going to come empty-handed? Are you going to just barge in? You're probably going to introduce yourself. Maybe you're going to share a little bit about who you are, and why, you know with the plants, like, you might share about why you're there. And you just listen. You're just going to hold space to get to know her, right? It's really not different in a lot of ways. You know, it's really not different. I think it is really just about being in sincere relationship, and creating the presence and the space, and the acts of just gentle reciprocity that, like, you don't, if you meet someone for the first time, you might not hug them right away. Or you might. It depends on the feeling, right? It depends on the relationship you build. It depends on the type of person they are. It depends on a lot of things, right? It depends on how much time you spent, on what kind of encounter you had, on whatever it is. So it's like, I think just paying attention to what you feel, and always asking permission if you are going to harvest. And I did want to say one thing. One of the things that I think, there's still ways to connect with the plants in the wild that allow you to still work with their energies without kind of compromising their environments. And one of the things that I love to do is make flower essences, because it's like a very beautiful, profound kind of medicine that really does not take plant material very much. And it's just as intimate, just as powerful. And so I think just spending time, and like being available in that way, and making an offering, and
Do you have a resource for people who want to learn how to make their own flower essences, or would you recommend that they actually do take a herbalism class?
I mean, I'm sure like Google has 5 million, or like
Yeah.
YouTube University probably has like a million tutorials on that. And there's probably like 6 million books. Um, and like, I think classes are great, personally, specifically for flower essences, because mostly because it's just really magical to do that work in a group. And I think, especially for people who are not as confident or as comfortable in their own way of listening or hearing the natural world, it can be really empowering to learn that in the context of a group, with and just in the collective space. I think you really learn a lot. You can really empower your own kind of nonlinear wisdom.
I agree. Yeah, I think that I know that my own attunement is way more heightened when I have others and there's just kind of collective focus. So I totally agree. Now, as we're just wrapping up, I'd like to ask you, which plant allies do you call on to help you when you're experiencing some of the really tough emotions like grief and like rage?
Mhm. It's a great question. Um, yeah, they're very un under acknowledged emotions. And the plants are so just masterful at helping with that. It's funny, one of my favorite medicines that I offer, which was inspired by a formula that I made for a very close friend that was grieving, is a grief formula. And it's very popular, I must say, because I think a lot of us just need help with that because it's really hard in our cultural context. So I'll give you some of my go-tos, and I just want to say that, kind of just back on the theme of relationship, that one of the things I've learned about plants is that sometimes the ones that can help you most are the ones you have the closest relationship to, even if that's not what they're quote unquote for. So sometimes when I'm going through something really hard, I find myself leaning in on a plant that I know in a particular way, that I may have not thought to go to for that before, because the relationship is the medicine. But I think that one of my favorite plants to work with for grief is sage. Another one are violets.
Mm.
So beautiful and sweet. And for rage, and in fact, I often use these together, the sage and the roses. I roses I think of a lot for anger and rage, and the rue, of course, which again is part of my relationship to that plant, but also just a really powerful and masterful plant at supporting us through strong emotions. And yeah, and so, but the sage is really one of my go-tos for the grief. Yeah,
And
and I
just to
like.
clarify for people, you're not talking about culinary sage. You grow and there's clary sage and there's other kinds. So what kind do you grow for that particular purpose?
Very interesting question. So I actually use Lebanese sage for that, but actually I think that, any kind of sage would probably help with that. I think that most sages have some qualities in common around their kind of their coolness, their
Mm.
grounding qualities, their clarifying qualities, and something about their relationship to, like, water and earth together.
Mm,
Like
mm,
grief as kind of
mhm.
a watery thing, and so, and just like their coolness and the way that they hold, they're very grounded plants.
So you could use culinary sage if that's what you got. If that's outside your back door.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I will definitely say, like, especially after the conversation we just had, like, please do not go harvest white sage.
Mm.
Please do not harvest white sage. It has become like a very, um, very unfortunate situation, especially,
Mm.
I have to say that too, being in LA, where white sage grows natively, and besides the way that it has compromised the practicing native communities who use that as a ceremonial plant, it's also, people don't know how to harvest properly, and they do a lot of damage. Like, those plants have a really important role in the ecosystem. They prevent land erosion and really important things like that. And they're practically endangered because of how trendy it has become. So if you do want to use white sage, go, you know, contribute money to a farm or a group of people that are restoring white sage or growing it in a sustainable way, and grow some yourself.
That's excellent advice. Thank you so much for this very educational discussion, Layla. I really appreciate you sharing your gifts, but also offering your wisdom and gentle counsel. And I will be sure to heed that. I'm going to include uh, the links to your teachers and anyone that you'd like to lift up as people you'd like to acknowledge, so that people can find that in the show notes, because you've given so many resources. It's been very generous. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It was great to talk to you.
I love that. The relationship is the medicine. And you know what else I'm going to remember about this interview are those 3 principles that Layla spoke about in terms of being in relationship with the plant realm. And what they said was it's about reciprocity, permission, and responsibility. I'm going to remember that forever. To learn more about Layla's work and what they call Plantcestral wisdom and medicine, you will find lots of links in my show notes, and also you'll find information that you can, follow around their work with the Swana Plant Medicine Hub and their teachers. They listed several wonderful people who are working with plant wisdom that I think you'll find very interesting. As always, I'd like to thank some of my listeners, and today I'd really like to acknowledge my local listeners. So from around here on Lekwungen territory in Victoria, over on the mainland, Vancouver, southern BC, the Okanagan, all of these places that I visited and where I've spent time on the land, it's really brought me up and raised me up, and I really appreciate being able to share this land with you. And speaking of land, if you'd like to come out and spend some time on the land with me in southwestern BC, the Caribou-Chilcotin area, you should consider coming on quest with me in June, spending the full moon on the mountain, spending time in ceremony and ritual, getting into a more interanimist relationship with the other inhabitants and the more than human realm. If you'd like to do that, again, just go to my website, carmenspanyola.com, CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.